Dr. Chaiken is a professor of anthropology at IUP and professor at the Robert E. Cook Honors College. She's an applied anthropologist who has conducted research in East Africa and Southeast Asia on a wide set of issues in economic development. She was elected as the recipient of the 2007 Nutritional Anthropologist of the Year Award by the Society for the Anthropology of Food and Nutrition. Most recently, her work is guided by a question of central concern to us all. How can we live in a world where 1/3 of the population has much too little to eat, while another third suffers from an excess of food, sometimes in the same country? In pursuing this question, Dr. Chaiken has worked with various international and United Nations organizations to help design programs for third world healthcare and education. These activities involve a range of research interests, including colonialism, medical anthropology, applied anthropology, and rural development. As we will hear tonight, her current research focuses on contemporary nutritional patterns and food security. So let's welcome Dr. Chaiken.
I want to thank everyone at SAR for making me feel so welcome and for this great invitation to come and join you to enjoy the beautiful weather of Santa Fe. It snowed 2 inches before I left Pennsylvania on Tuesday night. So I'm very happy to be here on many, many levels. Tonight I thought I would talk about what we know about the causes of food insecurity and hunger globally, and more importantly, what we can do to address those problems, because I think that's really the important challenge. Just before the new millennium, the United Nations got together and they developed the Millennium Development Goals. These were agreed to by the 189 members of the United Nations. The Millennium Development Goal Project is led by Jeffrey Sachs, who's a Harvard economist. And these goals were designed to really get at the root causes of the pervasive poverty and hunger that faces roughly 1/3 of the world's population. These are very appropriate goals from the point of view of most anthropologists because they're very holistic. And instead of looking at looking for top-down solutions, many of these are bottom-up solutions, which we feel are more likely to be effective. So let's talk about what the Millennium Development Goals are first, and then kind of that will help frame my discussion. The first goal, and the most important one, is to end poverty and hunger by 2015. Now that sounds like a very lofty and sweeping goal, but when you read the fine print, you realize that it doesn't mean nobody's going to go hungry, it just means fewer people are going to go hungry. The Millennium Development Project estimates that approximately 1 billion people in the world live on less than $1 a day. And no matter how you measure it, no matter how you economize, that is pernicious and unresolvable poverty. So one of the Millennium Development Goals is to address the very poorest populations in the world and to reduce the number of them that are living on less than $1 a day. The Millennium Development Goals are also focused on putting people to work and having their work be more productive. This is not about development aid and handouts. This is about creating better self-sufficiency in the poorest parts of the world. Some of the other goals focus on things that are also near and dear to the hearts of anthropologists, addressing social inequity, such as bringing educational opportunities to women. When we look at populations that are non-literate or have low literacy rates around the world, whatever the rate is for men of illiteracy, the rate for women in the same place at the same time is 3 to 5 to 8 times higher than the rate of illiteracy for men. So we recognize that there's a huge gender disparity in terms of access to education, and we know that this has long-term consequences for the welfare of communities. Another important target is the under 5 mortality, and I'm going to speak a little bit more about that, because we know that when children are dying, not only is that a humanitarian tragedy, but it has long-term economic repercussions for their families and makes it difficult for them to make decisions about reducing family size and managing resources. So the repercussions of child mortality are very long-term, not just for the child who died, but for the rest of the family that survives and is trying to grapple with these problems. And of course, one of the more recent issues we've had to confront is the proliferation of HIV/AIDS, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and more recently in Asia. So these are the majority of the Millennium Development Goals. There are others that are focused on sustainability and wise use of global resources, but really the majority of the goals on the Millennium Development Project focus on hunger and poverty. All of these goals tie back to the issue of getting people to have greater access to food, more consistent access to food, and allowing them to have more direction in their future lives and their own welfare. So how bad is it? It's easy to say that a third of the world's population go hungry. But when you break that down into the impacts of that, the numbers are in some ways very staggering. The 189 members of the United Nations all report and monitor through the World Health Organization and UNICEF the rate of mortality of children under 5. And this is a very sensitive measure of food access because children under 5 are the most vulnerable members of the population, particularly children between the ages of about 12 months and 36 months. This is the time when they need consistent and high-quality supplemental feeding beyond breast milk, but they're not at an age where they can necessarily eat and digest the foods that the rest of the family is consuming. So there's what's called a trough of mortality at that particular age. That's when kids are most vulnerable. So if we look at the 189 countries around the world for which this data is available, and we look at those at the very bottom of the list, these are the bottom 10 countries in the world, with the exception of the United States, which I put up there just to have as a sort of a frame of reference so you understand the scope of the problem. If we look at the bottom 10 countries in the world, all of them are in sub-Saharan Africa, except one that's of strategic interest to us at the moment, and that's Afghanistan, that ranked at number 3, third from the bottom. In fact, if we continued down the list, and we continued looking at the next 10, the bottom 10 through 20, and we looked at the next 10, the bottom 20 through 30, and we looked at the next 10, the bottom 30 through 40, all of those countries, with the exception of Afghanistan, are in sub-Saharan Africa. So clearly the problem is very geographically focused, and that presents particular problems for us. To put this in contrast for you, the rate of child mortality hovers between 200 and 250 in much of sub-Saharan Africa. 250 out of every 1,000 children, 25% of children die before their 5th birthday. And think about the impact that would have on any community. Nobody can weather that without some consequences. To put that in contrast, the country ranking number 40 from the bottom is Myanmar, which has also been in the newspapers a lot because of the terrible tsunami and the hurricanes there, the cyclone, and the devastation that has wrought. Number 41 is Yemen, and number 42 is Pakistan. So all of these are countries with which the United States has significant issues, and from a strategic, geopolitical standpoint alone, we probably need to pay attention to these numbers. The bottom country in the Western Hemisphere is Haiti, which has a rate of child mortality of about 48 per 1,000. So it's a fraction of what we see in sub-Saharan Africa. And the United States has a rate of 8 children per 1,000 mortality, and we're tied for the 151st rank out of 189 countries, and we are tied with Lithuania, Slovakia, Thailand, which many people consider a developing country, and the United Arab Emirates, sort of an interesting combination of countries that have the same rate of child mortality that we do. And one of the questions then is what causes this under 5 mortality? And if you look at this list, this accounts for the great majority of under 5 mortality on a global scale. Most of these are things that can be prevented, and can be prevented with relatively low technology and not very difficult to prevent. For example, measles, no child in America gets measles today and hasn't for 30 years or so because of widespread measles immunization. Pneumonia and related upper respiratory infections account for a third of child deaths. Every kid in America at some point, and I certainly was that kid on many occasions, ended up with a cold that became bronchitis, and they got sicker and sicker, and someone took them to a doctor and they got a course of antibiotics and it was over. Well, in developing countries, those kinds of interventions aren't available, and what can start off as a minor respiratory infection can become fatal in a very short period of time. Another one important to note, birth complications, especially neonatal tetanus, and immunization given to women during pregnancy will 100% prevent neonatal tetanus. And to the credit of Bill Gates and his wife, this has been one of the points that they put a lot of money into. They call it SNL. It's not Saturday Night Live. It's Saving Newborn Lives. And so they've put a lot of money into widespread neonatal tetanus immunization, and I give them a lot of credit for that. Diarrhea is also a very profound killer of children, and it's not the diarrhea itself that kills the kids, it's the dehydration that they experience, which weakens their systems even further and results in their death. We think of AIDS as being this terrible scourge for children in sub-Saharan Africa, and there's no doubt the impact is profound. But in terms of direct link to mortality, it's a relatively small problem compared to the others that we could potentially be dealing with. Another way to look at this is just the stark figure of 10 million children a year. A few years ago, The Lancet, which is the major journal, British journal in medicine, published an article with the provocative title, "Where and Why Are 10 Million Children Dying Each Year?" And this was a very comprehensive study that looked at many studies around the world. And the Lancet article concluded that on average, in each year, 10 million children die before their 5th birthday. The majority of those die from diseases such as I showed you on the previous slide, but they die also very directly because of malnutrition. Kids who had high enough nutritional status wouldn't die of measles. Kids whose nutritional status was okay would not die of upper respiratory infections. But if they're already weakened by malnutrition, a simple infectious disease can finish them off. And you know, if we look at our global resources, I don't think we can afford to waste 10 million children a year. Obviously, another profound issue to confront, particularly in Africa, is the scourge of HIV/AIDS. One of the hardest hit countries, and one of the countries for which we actually have reliable data, is Botswana. In many respects, Botswana is one of the countries about which to be optimistic in Africa. It's had a long, stable government. It has a relatively prosperous economy, but 25% of the people in their productive years are HIV positive. And most of those people do not receive the proper cocktail of antiretrovirals that can help manage the disease. No country can afford 25% of its prime population to be compromised in this way. And so, you know, again, the figures are really staggering. The death of people in their productive years has profound impacts long after their death and long before their death. Many cases when people are sick and dying of HIV, or dying of AIDS, they have to be taken care of by their children because they don't have anyone else they can turn to. One of the problems that's happened in areas where HIV is so common is that the traditional social safety nets that people had to take care of each other, clan groupings, women groupings, religious organizations, because there have been so many people who've been sick and affected, many of these traditional social safety nets have broken down. And they don't have anybody to turn to for help, so they turn to their own children. That means kids get pulled out of school. That means that kids are sent into the workforce, and particularly in agricultural labor at very early ages. And many of these kids become orphaned ultimately. It also, unfortunately, results in particular areas of the world where children become engaged in high-risk behaviors such as prostitution, because it's the only way they can make an income to help take care of their ailing parents. Obviously, These problems of health and conditions of living are related to sanitation as well. These numbers speak for themselves. I mean, none of us would want to live in a world of open sewers, and obviously many people in the world have to do so. Another factor which has become very pronounced in the past year, especially, but really over the past 3 years, I'm guessing many of you, like I, have a 401k plan. And I was just saying that when our statements came at the end of September, we didn't open them because it was just not going to be happy news. So we just paid no attention. The crisis that we're seeing in the global credit markets right now, in some ways has been foreshadowed by a crisis in food prices, which has been going on for about the past 3 years. Food prices globally have increased substantially, and especially for staple grains such as maize and rice and wheat. Some of this is done as a result of, in the industrialized world, of taking grains like corn that we could be using for feeding cattle or making hydrogenated or making corn syrup or putting in foods. Much of that corn is being siphoned off into biofuel production now. And many people say biofuels, oh, that's going to reduce our dependency on foreign oil. But at the moment, it is not an economically viable trade-off. Biofuels actually cost as much energy to produce as energy they put in your gas tank. And if we look at a large portion of corn being pulled out of the global food supply and put into its fuel supply, that's a reduction in the food supply just by definition. This means that less food is available and the cost of fuel has been going up, as we're all well aware of. And this means that whether we're talking about Santa Fe, New Mexico, or Iowa City, Iowa, or Harare, Zimbabwe, the cost of food has gone up and the cost of transporting the food has gone up, and the food prices are just skyrocketing. I've been collecting some data, sending out emails to anthropologists all over the world who are working in different settings. And we know that our grocery bills have been creeping up, but in many developing countries, we're documenting in 1 year increases in the price of staple foods between 30 and 100%. Now, none of us can accommodate that kind of radical price increase in any way. And I made the reference at the end that we're shifting to a reliance on what some have called fossil calories. I mean, I don't think any of us sort of think of ourselves as going out and eating fossils. But if you look at the way in which food is produced in the industrialized world, food production is highly dependent upon tractors and fertilizers and chemicals and pesticides, all of which are highly dependent on petrochemicals. And so what's happened in the past 50 years is that much of our food production has shifted from just producing food to producing food that's dependent upon the use of fossil fuels, non-sustainable resources. And so some have termed our diets now as being based on fossil calories. And there's real questions as to whether or not this is sustainable for the long term. So how did we get into this mess? These are children in a village in Mozambique where I've worked off and on for the last few years. These little girls were very curious about me, and I think that the kinds of looks of puzzlement on their faces is sort of what I would like to capture in this talk. We have a daunting task ahead of us. We have 1 billion people in the world who live on less than $1 a day. We have profound economic inequality at local levels, at regional levels, and certainly on a global scale. And as many people who have access to too much food, there are people who have access to too little. But I'm an optimist. I would not be in this game, I would not be working in economic development for the last 20 years if I didn't think there were ways of making it better. I simply couldn't get up and do it every day if I didn't think there were ways of making it better. And I should point out many of these slides, particularly the ones outside Africa, I can't take credit for. My husband, Tom Connolly, is an excellent photographer. And he was taking pictures of these children in Vietnam running across this bridge, and all I could think of was, they're 3 years old and they're running across this bridge with no sides and no one's paying any attention. But he got some great pictures of these kids playing. So if we look at this problem of food insecurity and inequality and poverty, what do we know that can actually address any of these problems? What are the things that we know that can work? And I'm showing here a picture of an entire village. This is in central an island, remote island in the Philippines called Palawan, and this is a village called Daan. And this is the entire village showing up to have their picture taken. And I think that is symbolic of what I'm trying to talk about. We need communities to pull together in order to address these problems. So, strategy number 1, we have to improve child survival. We have to find ways of getting children past their 5th birthday. If we don't, we find that people don't want to limit their family size, for example. Why should you have fewer children if you're expecting 25 or 30% of those kids to die before their 5th birthday? There's no incentive to limit family size, and it's difficult to invest in children until you know they've reached past that point of survival. So we know we have to improve child survival. All the parts of the world that have taken off economically, the very first step, the Taiwans of the world, the Thailands of the world, the very first step in their progress was radical improvements in the survival of children through a variety of different programs. And some of the ones we know are most successful have been sponsored by UNICEF and the World Health Organization, and these are the GOBI strategies, which stands for growth monitoring, weighing and measuring children to monitor their growth and progress, oral rehydration, to treat children who are having diarrhea, breastfeeding, which most of the developing world are champion breastfeeders, and we need to commend them for that, and then the 4th strategy, immunization. None of these require high-tech interventions or training lots of MDs or building big hospitals. These are all community-based interventions that people can be trained to do. For example, in the villages I've worked in Africa, we've tried to push oral rehydration so that parents know the minute the children are showing signs of diarrhea, they've got to intervene. And most people can't read and write. You can't write a recipe down for them, but everybody has a liter container that they use for measuring water out. So we show them a liter container, and we say, to that liter of container, you add this much sugar and that much salt. And everybody can learn that recipe to create an oral rehydration fluid that's very effective in keeping kids hydrated while they recover from these illnesses, so that they don't succumb to dehydration during a bout of diarrhea. So all of these interventions are very low tech. They're very relatively easy to introduce. They require very little outside resources, but they require a lot of community mobilization. And in many parts of the world, they've made a big impact. This is all part of a strategy called community-based primary health care, where we try to empower local communities to understand more about the causes of health problems and find means of addressing those health problems. This is a project I worked on with Save the Children, which has done terrific work in many parts of the world. This was also in Mozambique, where they had pictures that were drawn to show problems in local communities. And local women, called Anima Doras, were volunteers to go through the training to learn how to address health problems like the GOBI strategy and others, learn how to address these problems in their own communities. Each Anima Dora, for going through the training, she got a cloth wrapper that had an anti-AIDS message on it, and it was very colorful, and they were all happy to have those, and a baseball hat. And that's all they needed to commit 3 or 4 days of their life to go through the training, and then to hold weekly meetings with the women in their village. And so at the end of 1 year, they each nominate additional women to go for Anima Dora training, and this replicates through the whole community at very low cost. It's simply a matter of putting the right information in the hands of the people who need it. It's a very effective program. This is another one of Tom's prize-winning pictures. This is a little girl in Vietnam, and one of the important strategies we know is now called Positivedeviance, which doesn't sound like a very good thing at all. The point of Positivedeviance is to go into communities where we see kids where we see high rates of malnutrition, and we find the one kid that seems to be doing okay, and we figure out why. Why are some children and some families weathering the same storm that their neighbors are unable to weather. And we try to figure out what's going on that makes these kids thrive and others not, and replicate that on a community level. So it's, again, focusing on neighbors learning from neighbors with a little bit of expert outside intervention to try and figure out why some of these kids are thriving in circumstances of great poverty. Now, in addition to addressing the welfare of children, we know we have to address the status of women, because the status of women is the second thing directly tied with significant improvements in standard of living and reduction in poverty. This is also in Vietnam, in Hanoi, which is a city full of vibrant young women riding motor scooters to go to work. We know that improving opportunities for women, particularly young women, allows them to have better job opportunities, which translates to later age at marriage, which translates to fewer children born over the course of their lifetime, and better investments in the children that they do produce. So there's nothing to be gained, nothing to be lost by improving the status of women. Now, when we were in Vietnam, I also came up with another hypothesis about birth control, and I'm calling it my scooter hypothesis. If you have a place where people can begin to aspire to a middle class, which in this case might mean owning a motor scooter, you can only fit 2 kids and 2 parents on a motor scooter. You don't want to have too many extra kids because you can't take them all with you on your scooter. So I think that maybe one strategy we should be looking at globally is heavily subsidizing scooters. I'm joking, but obviously when you look at countries like Taiwan and Thailand and Vietnam, where there is this growing and thriving new middle class, they all are riding scooters. So something has to be going on. We only saw like one family that had more than 2 kids on a scooter. This was about the average. So we know that putting resources in the hands of women has tremendous benefit for not only the women, but their entire families. It gives money in women's hands. We know for a fact, study after study after study has shown that money in the hands of women translates into better welfare of their children. Greater likelihood they'll go to school, better child survival, better nutritional status, and it may be impolitic of me to say this, but putting those same additional resources, small amounts of money, in the hands of the children's fathers has no corresponding positive impact on the welfare of children. Women invest much more directly in the welfare of their children globally than do their fathers. And there's lots of important reasons for that. So a little bit of money in women's hands means food on the table for children. So in addition to addressing the health problems, we have to look at the other side of the equation, and that's producing more food and having more equitable access to food. So some countries have recently, like Vietnam, adopted a food-first policy. The price of food is skyrocketing all around the world. There are lots of farmers in Vietnam that would like to sell all of their rice to Saudi Arabia at a huge profit. And the Vietnamese government said, no, we will not export rice until we have enough of a surplus that everyone in our country is fed. And this takes great political will for countries to make this short-term economic sacrifice for the long-term assurance of food stability in their local economies. This has typically not happened in most of the world, where developing countries are desperate for earning foreign exchange. If they want to buy equipment or machinery or petroleum products, they can't use their local currency. They have to have dollars or euros or Japanese yen. And the only way they can do that is by exporting food, in many cases. So a few brave countries like Vietnam have drawn the line and said, food has to be our first priority as a national policy. And that's an important step in the right direction. And another important step is to have the right kind of green revolution. Now, these 2 pictures I'm showing you here are of rice paddies in Southeast Asia. And most of us know Asian people eat rice, but most of us don't think about what it takes to produce rice in Southeast Asia. This is in northern Vietnam, but same pictures could be taken in much of China, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, where there's these whole hillsides, entire watersheds that have been carved up into these stair-step steps of terraces where people grow rice. And they grow rice by incredibly meticulous hand labor. They scatter rice in these seed beds, which is what you see here, and it sprouts up so that it's about 4 or 5 inches tall. And then they pull up those little sprouts of rice by the roots out of this soft mud, and they tie them up in bundles, and every single rice plant is meticulously transplanted one by one by one by hand. And this is how the majority of rice in the world is grown. So when we talk about a green revolution, which was highly touted technology in the 1960s, it's true it improved the amount of food being produced. But it did so with two very important costs. First, the green revolution technologies have been heavily dependent on petrochemicals to produce fertilizers and similar kind of inputs. And secondly, the way that they've improved food production in many cases is by shortening the amount of time it takes from the planting to the harvest. Now, this is good in many respects because it means in some places of the world you can plant 2 crops a year instead of 1, and in a few places 3 crops a year. But it doubles the amount of labor that people have to put in to producing these crops. So this green revolution is not without consequences, and there's new focus in recent years on trying to make the green revolution more sensitive to the needs of the small farmer, of the subsistence farmer, rather than of big commercial farmers. One of those strategies is to focus on crops that are maybe not of big economic importance around the world. This is a man and woman standing next to their relatively newly planted cassava plant. There is no global market for cassava. There is no commodities board or futures trading for cassava. It's what poor people eat around the world. And so some of the new green revolution technologies have been focusing on improving the productivity and nutritional value of some of these traditional crops that people fall back on during hard times, because that's what they're actually eating. In this case, this is an area in Mozambique that was hit by a virus that affected cassava plants called the cassava brown streak virus. It's very similar to the virus that affected potatoes during the Irish potato famine. The plant looks okay up above, and then suddenly the leaves start to turn yellow, and the tuber, the root underneath, which is what people eat, they dig it up and it's a pulpy, rotten mess. And so Save the Children has found, working together with an agricultural research center, has found specimens of cassava that seem to be resistant to this pest. They've had these Anima Doras groups, these farmers groups get together, plant little plots of it to replicate it in mass quantity, and then the successive year, everybody takes those cuttings home and they transplant it in their own farms so they all have disease-resistant varieties to plant. Again, this is a relatively low-tech solution, but one that can have a huge impact in the amount of food people have access to. Third strategy is to focus on how do we improve people's incomes. So if they can't grow their own food, they have money to buy food. Or they have money to get them through the lean times. Most of the world is characterized by having, we talk about our seasons, the seasons are changing. Most of the world don't have fall and winter and spring and summer. They have rainy season, dry season, and hunger season. And so if we can put money in people's hands, we can help them weather these lean times of year, these hunger seasons. So maybe we're talking about 6 or 8 weeks instead of 5 or 6 months, which is true for many parts of the world. For example, in northern Mozambique, they've started planting cashew trees everywhere. Actually, many of these were planted prior to during the Portuguese colonial period and were kind of neglected during the Mozambican Civil War. They're now going back to these cashew trees, which everyone has kind of neglected for years, and having small-scale local cashew factories that are harvesting the cashews, cutting them, roasting them, packaging them, and shipping them off as a very high-cost or high-value crop that they can be selling and putting money in the pockets of local people. Another strategy are fair trade products, and probably many of you have seen this in fair trade coffee, for example, which is guaranteeing that the people who produce these crops that those of us in the first world enjoy are paid a fair wage for what they're doing. So these are ways of building on the agricultural economy in many parts of the world, but doing it in a way that compensates people more fairly for the hard labors that they put in. And I can guarantee you that none of us have worked on a daily basis as hard as farmers in developing countries do. their work is backbreaking and endless. And their poverty is not a product of lack of trying. It is a product of many factors beyond their control that have conspired to keep them poor. So if we can convert the economy into a way that allows people to be paid and compensated appropriately for the labors that they've expended, that's an equitable solution to part of their poverty. Another popular strategy has been microfinancing and microlending. Some of you have probably heard of the Grameen Bank. The founder of the Grameen Bank, Muhammad Yunus, won the Nobel Peace Prize a few years ago. The Grameen Bank is now being replicated in many places, but it was started in Bangladesh in 1976. And since 1976, they have given out 7.6 million loans, most of which are for small business development. And, you know, I could ask if anyone in the audience has ever started a small business and you go to a bank and you get a loan, and you're talking about $20,000 or $100,000. The average value of a Grameen Bank loan is $35. That's to go like buy one goat, you know, and that goat's going to make more goats. That is to go and buy the first cell phone for a village, and you become the phone company for your village. I'm serious. There are people who are the phone company for their village. So there's all kinds of little business plans that people have invented that have been financed by the Grameen Bank. Muhammad Yunus recognized that no bank would give poor people money. They're not credit worthy. So the secret to the Grameen Bank is that you can't borrow unless you have members of your community who come forward and say, this person is trustworthy, she will pay back the loan, because 97% of the borrowers have been women. She will pay back the loan, and if she won't, we will pay on her behalf. So it's people coming together and guaranteeing each other's future that has made the Grameen Bank work. They have over a 98% payment rate. Less than 2% of their loans default. And because they charge a very low interest on each of those loans, they have generated income to the point that they have, for the last few years, not accepted any donor funds. They're making money. It's a profit-making enterprise. Now, the other part of the Grameen Bank program, which was originally started, were called the 16 decisions. And these were decisions that the original core of Grameen borrowers said, these are the things that we need to do to reshape our society to be progressive. These are the things we need to challenge that hold us back in our own societies. Now, I'm willing to bet if any of you have ever gone to the bank for a loan, they have not asked you to sign a clause saying you will use a pit latrine. I'm willing to bet that none of you have ever had to pledge not to take dowry for a wedding. But these were recognized, these were identified by the original core of Grameen borrowers as obstacles to economic progress in their own communities and or obstacles to improving health and welfare in their communities. And so they came up with the 16 decisions, and now any borrower from the Grameen Bank has to agree to follow those 16 decisions. I saw an interesting interview with Muhammad Yunus, and someone said, I mean, do you really think that everybody follows these? I mean, isn't this just sort of lip service? And he said, well, the 10 Commandments are suggestions that not everybody follows, but if you hear them often enough, maybe they begin to stick. And so he used that analogy as a way of having people start having discussions, if nothing else, about the issue of dowry and what that says about the status of women. For those of you who are not familiar, dowry is not a nice prize that's paid when a couple gets married. This is money paid by the family of a girl to the family of a man to take her off their hands. This is not investing in a young couple and giving them a fresh start with, you know, a nice little bankroll. This is recognizing women as an economic liability and compensating a family who will take them on. And so this has, you know, this speaks volumes about the status of women in the societies where dowry is still being practiced. So this is a program that has shown tremendous success and is now being replicated in many, many parts of the world because we know that it can make a difference. getting kids into school, without question, an important strategy, because we know that adult women who have children, if adult women are literate, and they don't have to be very literate, they just have to be even minimally literate, their children have 50% the rate of malnutrition as women who've never gone to school. So literacy, particularly for females, is really critical. Save the Children, I worked on a program in Ethiopia where they started pastoralist schools. In southern Ethiopia and southern Sudan and northern Kenya, it's very, very dry. The people live by herding animals, and children had never gone to school. So they started pastoralist schools where someone who might have graduated only from about 6th grade was hired as a teacher to move with the pastoralists, to move with the cattle camps and teach the children as they move from place to place. Within a few months, the adults said, "Why are only the children getting to learn? We need to learn how to read and write too." And I remember it was a very profound experience for me. I was interviewing a man who had come in from the bush from one of these cattle camps. And he and his wife had started taking adult literacy in the evenings after everyone had finished cooking dinner and the children were going to bed. And I said, "So tell me, what was it like to learn how to read?" And he was nearly in tears. And he held up his thumb and shook it at me, and he said, "I will never have to sign a document with my thumbprint again. No one will ever cheat me again. I know how to read now. No one can take advantage of me." And he saw this as extremely empowering, and it is empowering. Imagine not being able to read and write. In Kerala, India, in the 1930s, they made the commitment to universal education. Kerala, India, one of the poorest areas of India, one of the poorest areas of the Asian subcontinent, has a nearly universal literacy rate because they started nursery schools where children are literally drawing numbers in the dust on the floor, and they recognize that they have to get children in school early and keep them in school. And by school, as you can see, in some cases there's not much to it. This is in Kenya, where I worked for many years some time ago on a UNICEF project, and this was the school in this particular village. In fact, most of the classes were held outside under a tree where it was actually easier for the children to sit and concentrate. I always thought it was interesting that there was a lesson about telling time on the chalkboard. Nobody in this village had a wristwatch. I mean, time was told by, you greeted people at different times of the day depending upon how high the sun was. I mean, that's what time really meant. But education is really key. Now, our government, the United States government, started many years ago with the McGovern-Dole School Lunch Program, which is part of a program of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This program has used surplus agricultural commodities from the United States, fortified cornmeal, powdered milk, cooking oil as the primary ingredients, stuff that we warehouse by the ton, and use this to subsidize school lunch programs in developing countries. They provided the food, local people had to cook it, and they provided sometimes breakfast and lunch, but usually just lunch. And this was a huge incentive for people to send their kids to school. The attendance at schools mushroomed in all of the communities where the McGovern-Dole program came in. Because if people didn't have to feed their kids one meal a day, that was a good enough economic trade-off to send them to school. Unfortunately, the recent farm bill that was passed last year has severely curtailed the funding for the McGovern-Dole program, which I frankly think is penny wise and pound foolish. We are not saving money in the long run by cutting back $300 million. I mean, $300 million is a lot of money to me, but to the U.S. federal government, $300 million is not a lot of money. And I think this was a very short-sighted policy on their part. We know that even minimal literacy has profound positive impacts for the next generation as women in particular become better prepared to take care of their children. We also know that we can effectively target specific micronutrient problems such as vitamin A deficiencies, iodine deficiencies that result in goiter and thyroid problems. And we know that we can do this in the same way that iodine has been added to salt in this country for many generations. We can also subsidize or fortify certain foods that everybody can afford to buy no matter how poor they are. For example, One of the strategies that's being promoted by those who are advocates of genetic modification of plants are the golden rice strains. These are strains of rice that have been developed in very high-tech research centers, and the rice is typically lacking in beta-carotene, which produces vitamin A in your system. Golden rice borrows genes from daffodils. It makes the rice yellow, and that has beta-carotene in it, which has positive nutritional impacts for people. But it's a very expensive technology to develop and a very expensive one to replicate. They've also found that you can have vitamin A sprinkles, sort of like salt, that can simply be sprinkled on food, distributed in little packets in communities, and with the reminder, once a week, make sure that your kids get some sprinkles, and it has the same kind of positive nutritional impact with a fraction of the cost. Another important strategy are RUTFs, ready-to-use therapeutic foods. The development world is full of acronyms. It drives me crazy. Perhaps the most important of these is plumpy nut. We didn't invent that name either. That was the French. The French came up with plumpy nut, which is a ready-to-use therapeutic food based on peanut butter, which is fortified with some micronutrients. And the idea of this is that these sealed foiled packages, which are full of calories and nutrients, are distributed in communities for severely malnourished children. And a blob of this is squeezed onto their porridge or squeezed onto a banana and fed to children. And there's miraculous recovery for even severely malnourished children with just the use of this food. A couple of positive steps that have happened in recent years, the French government that produces this has said, we will share the recipe with any country in the world as long as it's not a for-profit operation. And so peanuts and other foods are being used in other countries as the base for RUTFs. And small amounts of manufactured vitamins have to be mixed in the appropriate quantities. But we now know that these can be used to treat even severely malnourished children without having to send them to a hospital and away from their family. Their likelihood of completing the course of action is much higher than if we say, well, you have to go to the nutrition rehabilitation hospital, which most families can't afford to do. We also know that this is having some positive effects of people who are living with chronic disease, and in Africa that means HIV/AIDS. If you can keep people's nutritional status good enough, they will be able to keep fighting the disease and keep working and keep feeding their children. So targeted use of these high-energy foods also shows great promise. And then we have the question of monitoring areas at risk of hunger. During the Horn of Africa famines in the 1980s, I was actually working in Africa. We didn't know we were in the middle of famine. We just knew things were really, really bad. And it was only in the retrospect that we realized how bad they were. At the time, I was working in Kenya, and we went through a period of 3 months in the rural village where I lived, where you could not, even if you had money, you could not buy maize meal, rice, cooking oil, bread, sugar, tea, nothing. There was simply no food to buy because of a drought. And this was at the same time that a very brave photographer named Mohammed Amin went into these refugee camps and took these haunting photographic images of these emaciated children that showed up in the global press. As a consequence of that, many people were saying, wait a minute, it should never have gotten to this extreme situation. We should have been able to figure out what was going on long before it reached a crisis stage. So the United States government started FUSE, the Famine Early Warning Systems, which relies on satellite imagery of vegetation cover, climatic data about how much rainfall there's been, and they have all these fantastic mathematical modelings of areas to predict where food production is expected to be short. Now, the areas in red here are, as of last week, these are the FUSE critical zones. The orange areas are those that are at high risk of food shortage, and the yellow at a lower risk, and the green people are doing okay. Now, you might notice that only a few parts of the world are covered on this map, and all of the areas in white, it does not mean that there is no hunger. It means that the United States government doesn't view it of sufficient strategic interest to care, frankly, or to monitor what's going on. So our FUSE system is a very positive step in the right direction, but it does not have sufficient global coverage to really bring information to all of the people in positions of power who could do something about emerging hunger in many parts of the world, not just in the eastern seaboard of Africa and the big chunk of West Africa. You notice in Asia, the only country that's covered is Afghanistan. And in Central America, the only country that's covered is Honduras because of Hurricane Mitch. So in recent years, we've tried to have a bottom-up approach rather than having a satellite hovering overhead and saying, it looks like the crops are not doing very well. I've been working the last few years with several NGOs, most recently World Vision, which is a huge non-governmental organization working in many parts of the world, to do what are called CEWS, Community-Based Early Warning Systems. And these are predicated upon the assumption that local people understand what's going on. And they don't necessarily know what to do about it, but if we can give them some training and some direction, they can figure out where food is short, where their problems are, what sources of resilience they have, what kind of resources they can marshal to address these problems, and then partner with NGOs to get a little bit of additional financial support to address these problems. So this has actually been going on in Mozambique for the last few years. It's a new program called Gerando, and it's an acronym that stands for Community-Based Early Warning Systems. This has been, it's still in its infancy. It's not a fixed program, but the recent work that I've done for them is to say, okay, what do we know, what do people do when they're experiencing food shortage? We can predict this behaviorally. We don't have to just look at agroclimatic maps. We can say, these are the things we know people do when they're starting to experience food shortage. And so a community-based system trains local villagers to go out and once a month or once every 3 months, depending upon the area, they go out and ask a whole list of questions to people. Are you doing any of these things? And if they answer no to any of these economizing measures, then there's no problem. If they start answering yes, we monitor the frequency with which they're reporting these problems or these behaviors, and then there's a threshold or a tipping point at which interventions are intended. So these are just a few of the questions that we ask about. There's a list of probably about 100 questions that could be asked about increasing food scarcity. But people are not passive. They respond as they need to emergencies that they perceive occurring. So in this case, one of the things we said is, okay, let's say the community identifies increasing malaria risk as a problem. That means the community has to take action in the form of clearing brush so that the mosquitoes are not hiding in the brush, making sure that all of the water sources are tipped over and not pond scum where the mosquitoes are breeding. The NGO comes in as the partner and says, okay, well, we'll provide insecticide-impregnated bed nets because malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes, so people sleep under a bed net and it reduces the rate of transmission. We know from some World Health Organization studies that if we got 75% of the population in a village sleeping under a bed net, the rate of malaria drops almost to zero if it's consistent and everybody does it in a community. Another example was people identifying crop diseases as the problem that they were facing. So the local intervention is tell people that instead of leaving the residue in the crop in the field so that the insects or the disease pest is still in there and is going to contaminate next year's crops, you gather up all that residue, you have a little fire in the middle of the field, and that ash becomes a natural fertilizer for the field. The NGO then provides assistance in the form of a backpack sprayer for an insecticide, just as an example. The idea is that these are relatively low-cost interventions that partner and empower local people to address problems that they identify in their own communities. But this is the challenge. You have to have communities working together. This has to be a collective effort, and sometimes it has to be on a very large scale. So really, I want to conclude with simply the question is, do we view the access to food as a basic human right? Because if we do, and I do, I would argue we have it within our power to make sure that there are not hungry people in the world. If we view if access to food as a human right, we have it within our human power to fix that problem. There is not now, nor has there ever been in the history of the world, a global shortage of food. There is unequal access to food. And that is and always has been the problem. So if we recognize that as the problem, we recognize that there are strategies that we can use to address those problems. So I'll end with that.